When the rain struck the roof of her empty cabin, Sarah only heard the echo of her solitude. Her hands, accustomed to holding others, now only embraced memories. In her eyes, the reflection of a past that the wind had carried far away. But sometimes, the desert that seems empty holds the most beautiful secrets. And in the deepest silence, a new hope can be born. If this story touches your heart, give me your like as someone who lights a small light in the darkness. And tell me, how do you think Sarah's journey will end? Your experience could illuminate someone else's path. The sun punished the earth like a red-hot iron, merciless in its midday fury. Sarah Mitchell felt the sweat evaporate before it could even slide down her forehead, leaving behind a thin crust of salt and dust. Her lips, cracked by thirst and fear, barely remembered the taste of fresh water. 3 days had passed since she left Dodge City. 3 days walking forgotten paths, hiding like a wounded animal. Her boots, once elegant, were now torn by the stones of the road. Her blue dress, the only one she had managed to take with her, along with a small bundle of belongings, had turned grey from the desert dust. At 45 years old, Sarah never imagined seeing herself like this. A fugitive, alone, terrified. Each step cost her more than the previous one. The horizon undulated like a cruel mirage, and her thoughts frayed in her mind like threads from an abandoned tapestry. Victor Brennan's threats echoed in her ears. "It doesn't matter where you hide, Sarah. No one escapes a debt to me." The owner of the region's most powerful saloon didn't forgive those he considered traitors, and her husband had taken that secret to the grave, leaving her with the burden of a debt she never knew existed. When her legs finally gave way under the meager shade of an old oak tree, Sarah felt herself dissolving into the earth. Her last conscious thought was a wordless prayer, a plea to the indifferent sky. Then only darkness. When she opened her eyes, she first saw dust dancing in a ray of light. A rough wooden ceiling covered her. The creak of a chair alerted her. She was not alone. "You've slept almost a full day," said a rough voice, as if rarely used for speaking. Sarah tried to sit up. The man seated at a respectful distance didn't move to help her, but he didn't seem threatening either. Tall, lanky, with a face weathered by sun and solitude. His eyes, however, had a quality she recognized immediately. The same kind of caution she had learned to cultivate over the years. "My name is Daniel Reed," he continued, offering her a bowl with water. "I found you under the oak tree. You seemed—" He fell silent, as if words were a luxury he couldn't afford. She took the water with trembling hands, drinking slowly. Each sip was a miracle that awakened her numbed senses. "Sarah Mitchell," she finally responded, not knowing how much more she should reveal. "Thank you for not letting me die out there." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable but necessary, as if both knew that true words needed time to form, to find the courage to manifest in a world that hadn't been kind to either of them. Daniel's cabin was like him, austere, functional, built to endure rather than to welcome, a home where words were as scarce as comforts. Sarah spent her first day awake observing every detail: the unvarnished pine table, the irregular stone fireplace, the exposed beams where dried herbs and kitchen utensils hung. There were no decorations or visible memories, nothing that suggested a personal history. Through the only window, she could see a corral with a few head of cattle and an old sand-colored horse grazing unhurriedly. Beyond, the prairie extended until it merged with the sky, an immensity that was both promise and threat. Daniel came and went without warning, performing tasks that followed a rhythm as natural as the seasons. He brought firewood, water from the well, fed the animals. Occasionally he looked at her briefly, as if making sure she was still there, like someone checking that a wounded bird hasn't escaped from the box where he's sheltered it. Sarah felt strange in that masculine space, so devoid of the small touches that make a refuge a home. But something in the simplicity of those walls was comforting to her. Here there were no elaborate lies or secrets hidden under layers of social courtesy. Truth was naked and visible, in every worn board, in every strictly necessary object. During dinner, a simple stew of dried meat and potatoes, Daniel spoke as little as during the day. He ate methodically with the efficiency of one who sees food as fuel, not as pleasure. "How long have you been here?" she dared to ask, breaking the ritual of silence. Daniel chewed slowly before answering. "This land belonged to my father. I built the cabin." He made a mental calculation. 12 years ago, maybe. "It's good work," she commented, running her fingers over the wood of the table. "Solid." He nodded, as if that small recognition were enough. He didn't ask why she was alone in the desert, or where she came from, or where she was going. Sarah appreciated that respect for her secrets, though she suspected it was not so much courtesy as disinterest in others' complications. That night, lying in the bed he had given her, Daniel now slept by the fire. On blankets spread on the floor, Sarah listened to the sounds of the desert. The wind that whispered through the cracks in the wood seemed to tell her stories of other women who had fled, of other fears, of other solitudes. For the first time in many days, she didn't cry herself to sleep. On the third day, when the sun barely hinted at its presence on the horizon, Sarah woke before Daniel. She watched him sleep, vulnerable in his rest as he wasn't during the day. The wrinkles on his forehead softened, and he looked younger, almost innocent. What story had carved those lines on his face? What losses had he accumulated to build those walls of silence? With silent steps, she explored the cabin in the dawn's half-light. She found few personal objects: an old pocket watch that didn't work, a worn book of Whitman's poems, a shirt carefully folded under the makeshift pillow. Small testimonies of humanity in that survival refuge. Opening her own bundle, the few belongings she had managed to rescue returned fragments of her previous life to her. A tortoiseshell brush that had belonged to her mother. A faded photograph of her with her husband Thomas on their wedding day, 18 years ago. A handkerchief embroidered with her initials. Objects insignificant to anyone else, but for her, anchors to an identity that seemed to be dissolving. When Daniel woke, he found her sweeping the dirt floor with an improvised broom made of branches. "You don't have to do that," he said, uncomfortable with this domestic invasion. "I need to feel useful," she replied simply. "I can't accept your hospitality without offering something in return." He didn't insist. Perhaps he understood better than many the need to maintain dignity when everything else has been lost. During breakfast, bitter coffee and stale bread, Sarah felt her mind traveling between two worlds. The past in Dodge City, where she had been the respectable wife of a merchant, hostess of small social gatherings, known for her apple pies and her discretion. And this uncertain present, where she was a fugitive sharing a roof with a stranger who barely spoke. "My husband died 3 months ago," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "Pneumonia, it was quick." Daniel looked up from his cup but said nothing. His silence was an invitation to continue, not a barrier. "After his death, I discovered he had debts. With dangerous people," she continued, carefully choosing each word. "The kind of people who don't accept that a widow can't pay what her husband owed. The kind of men who take other forms of payment." The last sentence hung between them, charged with implications. Daniel nodded once, understanding without need for details. "Here you're safe," he finally said with a simplicity that made Sarah believe him. For now. That "for now" contained a truth they both knew. No place was safe forever, no refuge was impenetrable. But for that day, for that morning, it was enough. The days began to weave into recognizable patterns. Sarah would wake with the first rays of sun, prepare coffee in the old iron coffee pot, mend clothes or clean while Daniel tended the cattle. At midday they shared a simple meal, exchanging few words but many glances. In the afternoon, each attended to their tasks, he caring for fences or hunting, she transforming that austere space into something more livable. It was in those shared silences where Sarah began to rediscover herself. Without the corset of social expectations, without the judging looks of neighbors, without the weight of pretending to be what she wasn't, her hands remembered forgotten skills. She braided baskets with reeds she collected near the stream. She prepared dyes with wild herbs. When Daniel brought flour from a trip to the nearest village, she baked bread in the outdoor clay oven they had built together. "This tastes like..." "Before," he said one night, holding a piece of warm bread as if it were a fragile treasure. "Before what?" she asked, feeling they were approaching something important. Daniel chewed slowly, looking at the fire. "Before everything broke." "He Nally responded. He said no more, but it wasn't necessary. Sarah knew that feeling. The before and after. The invisible line that divides life into two irreconcilable halves. For her it had been Thomas's death and the discovery of his debts to Victor Brennan. For Daniel, something he still didn't name but that had left visible scars in his way of moving through the world. One afternoon, while they washed clothes in the nearby stream, their hands accidentally touched in the cold water, a fleeting contact, insignificant to any observer, but which sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It wasn't desire, not exactly. It was the shock of recognizing she was still alive, that her body still responded to human contact after months of emotional isolation. Daniel withdrew his hand as if he had been burned, but his eyes for an instant reflected the same surprise. Neither mentioned the incident. They continued rubbing clothes against the stones, wringing, hanging them in the sun. But something had changed in the air between them, like when the barometer drops announcing a distant storm. That night Sarah dreamed of the sea, though she had never seen it. A vast and tranquil ocean that invited her to submerge without fear. She woke with the sensation of salt on her lips and a strange certainty growing in her chest. This place, this cabin lost in the desert, was where she should be now. Not forever, perhaps, but yes, to heal. Sometimes, on particularly clear nights, they would go out to sit on the front steps. The stars seemed so close that Sarah felt she could reach them by extending her hand. The silence between them had transformed with the passing days, becoming more comfortable, almost eloquent. "I never knew their names," Daniel said one of those nights, pointing at the sky. "My father said they were just lights, that it didn't matter what they were called." Sarah observed his profile silhouetted against the night. It was the first time he had mentioned his father voluntarily. "My mother taught me some constellations," she responded softly. "That one is Cassiopeia, the Vein Queen. And there is Orion, the Hunter." She pointed to groups of stars, drawing imaginary shapes with her finger. Daniel followed her hand attentively, like a child discovering a new world. "I never had a mother," he confessed after a long silence. "Or maybe I did, but I don't remember her. My father," his voice tensed slightly, "wasn't a man of stories or stars with names." Sarah felt the weight of the unsaid. The absences in his story spoke of pain, of early losses, of a childhood without tenderness. "Mine made perfumed soaps," she said, offering him in exchange a fragment of her own story. "With lavender she grew in pots. Our neighbors thought it was an unnecessary luxury, but she said beauty is never a waste, even in everyday things." Daniel nodded slightly, as if thanking her for that gift of words. Then, without warning, he got up and went into the cabin. He returned moments later with something in his hand, a small piece of carved wood. "I made it a long time ago," he said, extending it to her. "It's nothing much. It was a simple figure, a horse in full gallop. Despite the rusticity of the carving, he had captured the movement, the animal's freedom." Sarah held it in her hands, feeling the texture of wood polished by years of being touched. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Did you make it?" Daniel nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. "My father had horses. Good horses." His words came out haltingly, as if each one cost physical effort. "He sold them all. For liquor. Except Copper." He pointed toward the corral where the old sand-colored horse rested. "That one was too old and thin to be worth anything." Sarah understood he was entrusting her with not just an object, but a story. A wound. The wooden figure was a talisman he had held on dark nights, a memory of something beautiful in a childhood she intuited was devoid of beauty. "I'll take care of it," she promised, closing her fingers over the figure. "Thank you for trusting it to me." Later, lying in the darkness, she held the carved horse against her chest. A simple object that represented more than a gift. It was a bridge built between two solitudes. A first step toward trust. The shared routine had softened the edges of their coexistence. Sarah already knew Daniel's habits. How he took coffee, black, no sugar. His way of checking the door bolt twice before going to bed. The unconscious gesture of rubbing an old scar on his forearm when he was worried. Small details that composed an intimate portrait of the man with whom she shared a roof. One morning, while Daniel repaired a broken chair, Sarah dared to ask about the scar. "It was—" he began, leaving the sentence suspended. Then, as if deciding it was time, he continued, "My father. He had a bad temper when he drank. And he drank almost always." He said it without self-pity, like someone mentioning a meteorological fact. "It rained almost always. It was cold almost always. My father hurt me almost always." "I'm sorry," she said, resisting the impulse to touch the mark. "He died long ago," he responded, shrugging. I was 16. He drank until his liver gave up. Sarah nodded, respecting the apparent indifference she knew was armor built over years. My father was a Methodist pastor, she offered in exchange. A good man, but severe. He believed the road to heaven was paved with sacrifices and renunciations. He smiled little. Daniel looked at her, surprised by this voluntary revelation. Is that why you married a merchant? To escape. The question, so direct, disconcerted her. She had never thought of it in those terms, but it contained a truth she hadn't wanted to face. Maybe, she admitted. Thomas was kind, stable. He didn't demand too much except loyalty. He offered me a quiet, predictable life. Until it no longer was, Daniel completed. Sarah felt the sting of tears. It was the first time someone had openly acknowledged the betrayal she had felt upon discovering Thomas's debts, his secret life of gambling and loans, the broken promises that had left her vulnerable to men like Victor Brennan. I never knew who he really was, she confessed, her voice breaking. 18 years together, and in the end he was a stranger. Daniel left the chair and approached slowly like someone approaching a frightened animal. He sat facing her at a respectful distance. Sometimes, he said in a grave voice, it's better to know a stranger than to discover you never knew who you thought you knew. The phrase, in its philosophical simplicity, moved her deeply. This man of few words had captured exactly her feeling of helplessness, of shifting ground beneath her feet. That afternoon, while hanging clothes under the merciless sun, Sarah reflected on that idea. Daniel was effectively a stranger. They shared no past, no common references, no social circle. And yet, in a short time, she had come to know parts of him that perhaps no one else had seen. His gentleness disguised under layers of roughness, his innate sense of justice, his capacity for compassion without words. That night, she took from her bundle the last treasure she had brought with her, a small bottle of lavender essence, the only luxury she had allowed herself to keep. She placed it on the table where Daniel could see it. It was my mother's, she explained. Her recipe. To remember that beauty matters even when everything else crumbles. He took the bottle with reverent care, like someone holding a sacred object. He opened it and breathed deeply, closing his eyes. When he opened them, there was a moist brightness in them that he didn't comment on. It smells like life, he said simply, returning the bottle to her. But he didn't place it in her hand, rather next to the carved horse she had left on the table. The two objects side by side seemed to dialogue in silence. Past and present, loss and encounter. Two broken lives that, in some mysterious way, were beginning to repair each other. The visitor arrived at dawn, when mist still floated over the grasslands like a ghostly mantle. Sarah saw him first, a solitary rider approaching slowly to the cabin. Fear, that old acquaintance, coiled in her stomach like a serpent. Daniel came out to meet him, rifle in hand but not aiming. From the threshold, Sarah watched, holding her breath. The man dismounted. He was older than Daniel, with grey beard and sharp eyes under a worn hat. Samuel, Daniel greeted, lowering his weapon. I didn't expect to see you until spring. Bad news doesn't respect seasons, boy, the man responded, removing his hat upon noticing Sarah's presence. Ma'am. Daniel made a brief gesture and she approached, trying to control the trembling in her hands. Samuel Foster, my nearest neighbor, Daniel introduced. 20 miles from here. Sarah Mitchell, she responded, trying to smile. The old man's eyes scanned her face with a mixture of curiosity and understanding that disturbed her. I passed through Willow Creek 3 days ago, Samuel said, now addressing Daniel. There are posters with a woman's description. They're offering a reward for information. The air between them became dense, charged with implications. Who? Daniel asked, though Sarah suspected he already knew the answer. Victor Brennan, Samuel confirmed. The same bastard as always, using the law for his own ends. He convinced the sheriff that this woman, he looked at Sarah without disguise, robbed him. That she's a criminal, Sarah felt the world contract around her. It wasn't a surprise. She knew Brennan would look for her. But hearing it confirmed, knowing that her description circulated on wanted posters, that any traveler could recognize her and turn her in for a few coins, the reality of her situation struck her with new force. I didn't steal anything, she said with a firm voice despite the fear. My husband owed him money. When he died, Brennan came to collect. But what he wanted wasn't money, it was... She stopped, unable to complete the sentence. Both men understood without need for words. "That guy has half a dozen girls working for him at the saloon," Samuel growled with contempt. "Some by choice, most not. He has an agreement with the sheriff." "And with the judge. Wait, does he know she's here?" Daniel asked, with a calm that contrasted with the tension in his posture. "I don't think so," Samuel replied. "But he's checking all the ranches and cabins in the region. It's a matter of time." A heavy silence fell over them. Sarah felt she should speak, offer to leave, not endanger Daniel. But before she could form the words, he stepped forward. "Thanks for the warning, Samuel. I'll keep it in mind." It was a polite but clear dismissal. The old man nodded, understanding. "Be careful, boy," he said, mounting again. "Brennan doesn't come alone. He has that thug, Crawford, always with him. And others he hires as needed. It wouldn't be the first time someone comes looking for trouble with me," Daniel responded with grim confidence. When Samuel rode away, Sarah turned to Daniel, words crowding in her throat. "I can't stay," she said hurriedly. "It's not fair to expose you to this. Brennan is dangerous. He has influence, money." Daniel looked at her for a long time as if evaluating something inside himself. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he finally asked. The question disarmed her. They both knew the answer. "I'll think of something," she insisted. "Maybe California or further north." "With what money?" he interrupted, practical. "With what protection?" Sarah lowered her gaze, defeated. He was right. She was trapped, without resources, without allies. "I can't drag you into my problems," she murmured. Daniel stepped closer, slightly invading the space he had always maintained between them. "Maybe I choose to be dragged," he said with an intensity that surprised her. "Maybe I'm tired of living alone with ghosts." Their eyes met, and Sarah saw in them a determination that went beyond simple chivalry or duty. There was something more, something she didn't dare name but recognized because it was also growing in her own chest. A bond forged in shared silences, in fragmented stories, in small daily gestures. "We'll prepare the cabin," he decided, returning to his practical tone. "If they come, they won't find us unprepared." That night, while they reinforced doors and windows, Sarah understood she had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer just a fugitive seeking temporary refuge. She was someone willing to fight for her freedom, for her right to choose her path. And, perhaps most surprising, she wasn't alone in that fight. The following days passed in a strange, tense calm, like the air before an electrical storm. Every distant noise, every cloud of dust on the horizon could be the prelude to Brennan and his men's arrival. But it could also just be the wind or a wild animal, or Samuel returning with more news. Daniel devoted himself to preparing the cabin as if expecting a siege. He stored water, checked ammunition, reinforced the back door with additional planks. Sarah watched him work, admiring the precision of his movements, the calm with which he faced imminent danger. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked one afternoon while he sharpened a hunting knife with methodical movements. "Life teaches," he responded tersely. "And mistakes if you survive them." One afternoon he surprised her by taking out a revolver from a hidden compartment under the floorboards. It was a Colt that looked old but well maintained. "You should know how to use it," he said, offering it to her butt first. "Just in case." Sarah looked at the weapon with apprehension. She had never held one, much less fired one. In her previous life, guns were men's things, objects foreign to her world of Sunday teas and embroidery. "I don't think I can," she murmured. "It's not a matter of can, but of need," he insisted. "If they come for you, what will you do? Beg?" The harshness of the question made her react. He was right. She had begged once when Brennan came to collect Thomas's debt. Her pleas had only provoked laughter and more explicit threats. With trembling hands, she took the revolver. It was heavier than she had imagined, cold and solid. "Not like that," Daniel corrected, adjusting her grip. "Firm, but don't tense your fingers too much. The weapon is an extension of your arm, not your enemy." For hours, he taught her to load, aim, prepare for recoil. They practiced with empty cans placed on a log, far from the cabin to avoid attracting attention. The first shots were disastrous. Sarah instinctively closed her eyes, startled by the bang and the recoil that made her whole body tremble. But Daniel was a patient teacher. He didn't scold her, just adjusted her posture, reminded her to breathe, showed her again and again until the movement began to feel natural. On the third day of practice, she managed to hit a can. The satisfaction she felt surprised her. It wasn't pleasure in destruction, but in the newly discovered capacity to defend herself. To take control. Good, Daniel said with something like pride in his normally neutral voice. Very good. That small approval meant more to her than all the social compliments she had received in her previous life. It was genuine, earned through effort, based on real skill and not social conventions. That night, while they ate the stew that had become their usual meal, Sarah noticed that her own hands no longer trembled. The fear was still there, of course, but it had changed form. It was no longer paralyzing. It had transformed into contained energy, into determination. If they come, she said suddenly. I'll fight. Daniel looked at her over his plate, evaluating her with new eyes. I know, he replied simply. In those two words was a recognition that Sarah treasured. This man saw her as she was now, not as the woman who had arrived dehydrated and terrified at his door. He saw her emerging strength, her capacity for adaptation. He respected her not out of courtesy, but because she had earned it. Later, while they washed dishes together, a domestic routine that now seemed precious in its normalcy, their hands brushed under the water. This time, neither pulled away. The contact lasted barely seconds, but it was like a silent conversation, a tacit agreement. They were together in this, whatever this was that was growing between them. The storm came first from the sky, not from human hands. Dark clouds congregated on the horizon all day, and at sunset, rain began to fall furiously on the cabin's roof. Wind howled through the cracks, making the oil lamp flames dance. Sarah watched the storm from the window, mesmerized by the violence of the elements. In Dodge City, storms were inconveniences to be weathered under umbrellas or in closed carriages. Here in the middle of the desert, they were primordial events that reminded of human insignificance before nature. Daniel entered soaked after securing the animals in the stable. His shirt clung to his torso, revealing the wiry thinness of a man accustomed to hard work and meager rations. It'll be a long night, he commented, drying his hair with a rag. The stream will rise. Hopefully that will also keep unwanted visitors away. The indirect mention of Brennan brought Sarah back to the reality of her situation. Even here, in this moment of intimacy forced by the storm, the threat floated between them, like a third occupant of the cabin. Do you think they'll come soon? She asked, moving away from the window. Daniel shrugged while changing his wet shirt for a dry one. With the naturalness of one who has lived alone so long, he has forgotten conventions. If Samuel is right, and he usually is, they'll have already visited the ranches closest to town, he reasoned. That gives us some time, but not much. A particularly violent thunder shook the wooden walls. Sarah startled, hugging herself instinctively. I never liked storms, she confessed, trying to smile. My mother said they were the voices of ancestors arguing in the sky. My father said they were a good time to drink, Daniel responded dryly. Any time was, really. Despite the tension, Sarah smiled at that unexpected flash of dark humor. Daniel rarely spoke of his father, and when he did, it was always with that distant tone, like someone describing a landscape seen through a fogged window. The storm forced them to stay closer than usual. The cabin was small, but until then they had managed to maintain their respective spaces through carefully choreographed routines. That night, however, they shared the fire's warmth, seated on both sides of the fireplace. The dancing light projected shadows on their faces, creating an intimacy that made talking easier. What will you do when this is over? He asked suddenly. If we manage to resolve the Brennan problem. The question took Sarah by surprise. She had been so focused on surviving the present that she had barely thought about the future. I don't know, she admitted. I suppose I'd have to start over. Somewhere no one knows me. Is that what you want? To forget everything? To be someone else? There was something in his tone, a barely perceptible vulnerability, that made her look at him more carefully. It's not about forgetting, she responded slowly, searching for precise words. It's about choosing which parts of myself I want to keep. Which parts are worth saving? Daniel nodded as if she had touched an important truth. When my father died, he said, looking at the fire instead of her, I promised myself I'd never be like him, that I'd build something different, something clean. Sarah understood he was offering her a central piece of his story, The motivation that had shaped his solitary life, his self-sufficient cabin, his reserved but honorable way of moving through the world. "You've achieved it," she said sincerely. "This house, this land, you've created something beautiful." He seemed surprised by the word beautiful. He looked around as if seeing the cabin for the first time, the rough beams, the simple furniture, the improvised curtains she had sewn from scraps. "I'd never seen it that way," he confessed. "Has something beautiful. Beauty isn't always in the perfect," she responded, remembering her mother's words. "Sometimes it's in what has been repaired, in what has survived." Their gazes met and held for the first time without barriers, without the usual caution. In that moment, illuminated by the fire while the storm roared outside, Sarah felt something inside her settle. A new certainty, fragile but powerful. She belonged here, not to the cabin itself, or even to this wild territory, but to this emotional space they had built together. This refuge made not of wood and nails, but of shared truths and understood silences. A creak in the roof startled them. Daniel got up to check that it wasn't a leak. While watching him move with practical efficiency, Sarah understood that what she felt for him wasn't gratitude or dependence, or even the affection born of forced coexistence. It was something deeper and simpler at the same time: recognition. She recognized in him a kindred soul, someone who had also lost and survived, who carried visible and invisible scars, who understood the value of a safe space. When he returned to sit, he was closer than before, so close she could feel the warmth of his body, smell the scent of wet earth and wood that always accompanied him. Neither spoke. Words seemed superfluous in that moment, as if they had reached a level of communication that transcended language. Outside, the storm was beginning to calm. Thunder moved away, wind quieted. But inside the cabin, something new was taking shape, an intimacy born not of desire or need, but of mutual recognition of two wounded souls that together might be able to heal. The days following the storm brought unexpected greenness to the desert landscape. Small wildflowers sprouted between the rocks. The stream ran with renewed energy, and even the air seemed cleaner, washed of dust and memories. Sarah and Daniel had established a new routine, closer, with fewer empty spaces between them. They worked side by side in daily tasks, shared stories during meals and at night, sitting by the fire. The silence between them was comfortable, full of unexpressed but understood meanings. One morning, while gathering wild vegetables that had sprouted after the rain, Sarah found herself humming a forgotten melody. Daniel listened attentively as if capturing each note. "It's pretty," he commented. "What song is it?" "A lullaby my mother sang," she replied, smiling at the memory. "I hadn't thought of it in years." "Sing it," he asked with unusual softness in his voice. Sarah hesitated, suddenly shy. It had been so long since she'd sung for anyone. In Dodge City, appropriate songs for a respectable lady were hymns in church or sentimental ballads on the parlor piano. Never these ancient melodies, transmitted from mother to daughter like precious secrets, but here in this clearing by the stream, with sun filtering through new leaves and hands stained with earth, who could judge her? She began to sing softly, Spanish words emerging from a forgotten corner of her memory. "By the river's edge grows a golden flower that only blooms when no one watches." The lullaby spoke of a magical flower that granted wishes, but only to those who didn't seek its power, to those who appreciated it for its beauty and not for what it could give them. A lesson about selfless love, wrapped in a simple melody. When she finished, Daniel was looking at her with an expression she couldn't interpret. It wasn't just admiration, it was something more complex, as if he had discovered a new landscape within her. "My grandmother was Mexican," Sarah explained. "My mother learned these songs from her, then taught them to me. My father didn't approve of them, said they were pagan superstitions. So we sang them in secret when he wasn't there." Daniel nodded, understanding the value of that shared memory. "She had a beautiful voice," he said, like someone stating a fact. "You should sing more." The simplicity of the compliment moved her more than any elaborate gallantry received in her previous life, because it came from him, because she knew Daniel never said anything he didn't truly feel. The day passed in almost perfect calm. Sarah felt that for the first time in months she could breathe fully, without the constant weight of fear oppressing her chest. It was dangerous, she knew, this feeling of security. Brennan was still looking for her. The danger hadn't disappeared. It had only shifted temporarily. But in that moment, under the warm afternoon sun, with Daniel working nearby and the cabin waiting for them like a safe refuge, she allowed herself to enjoy that borrowed peace. That night, while they ate the stew of wild vegetables and rabbit meat they had prepared together, Daniel seemed restless. He repeatedly looked toward the window, as if expecting to see something in the exterior darkness. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked. He shook his head, but his eyes remained vigilant. "Just a feeling," he responded vaguely. Later, when they were preparing to sleep, Daniel checked the revolver twice before leaving it within her reach, a gesture he hadn't made the previous nights. "Daniel," Sarah insisted, gathering courage, "tell me what's worrying you." He remained silent for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. "Copper is nervous," he finally said, "and the coyotes haven't sung tonight." To anyone else, these would have been trivial observations. But Sarah had learned to value Daniel's connection to the land, his ability to read signs that passed unnoticed by her. "Do you think there's someone out there?" she asked, feeling fear return like a familiar shadow. "I don't know," he replied honestly, "but I prefer to be prepared." He approached her, something he rarely did in the intimate space of night, when each retreated to their corner of the cabin. "Sarah," he said her name like someone pronouncing something valuable. "Whatever happens, I won't turn you over to Brennan. I need you to know that." The intensity of his promise left her speechless. It wasn't just a declaration of protection. It was something deeper, a commitment that went beyond duty or chivalry. "I know," she replied, holding his gaze. "And I won't run. Not again. This time I'll fight for my freedom, for this." That indefinite "this" floated between them, charged with meanings. The life they had built together, the laboriously established trust, the feelings that grew without name, but with increasingly deep roots. Daniel nodded once, as if sealing a pact. Then, in a gesture that surprised her with its delicacy, he lightly brushed her cheek with his fingers. A fleeting touch, barely perceptible, but which sent a shiver down her spine. "Rest," he said simply. "I'll keep watch first." That night, lying in the darkness, Sarah thought about how she had changed in these months. The woman who had arrived dehydrated and terrified at this cabin no longer existed. In her place had emerged someone stronger, more determined, more authentic. Someone capable not just of surviving, but of choosing for whom and why to fight. Sleep finally overtook her, lulled by the rhythmic sound of Daniel sharpening his knife by the fire, a sound that, paradoxically, brought her more comfort than the prayers she had recited all her life. Dawn brought with it the sound they had feared, approaching horse hooves. Daniel woke her with a silent gesture, already fully dressed and alert. One look was enough to understand. They had arrived. With movements practiced in previous days, they prepared. Sarah dressed quickly, pulled her hair into a severe bun and took the revolver. Her hands, she noted with surprise, were steady. Fear was still there, but now it coexisted with something stronger, determination. "Remember the plan," Daniel murmured. "If things get complicated, you go through the trapdoor and run toward the stream. Samuel will be waiting with a horse at the north bend." She nodded, though they both knew she wouldn't flee. Not now. Not after everything they had shared. The riders, 3 according to her count, stopped in front of the cabin. From the window, Sarah immediately recognized Victor Brennan's robust figure. Even at distance, his red face and arrogant posture on horseback exuded the same cruelty she remembered. Beside him, like a perpetual shadow, the lanky Crawford with his characteristic black hat and predatory gaze. The third man was a stranger, probably a hired gunman, Daniel Reed. Brennan's voice resonated in the morning air. "We know she's in there." The Turner widow. Daniel and Sarah exchanged a glance. There was no point in pretending. "Stay here," he ordered, heading to the door. "No," she replied firmly, following him. "Together." After a moment of doubt, Daniel nodded. He understood this was as much her fight as his. They went out to the porch side by side. Daniel carried his rifle, not aiming but ready. Sarah kept the revolver hidden in the folds of her skirt. Brennan smiled upon seeing her, a smile that didn't reach his pig-like eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted with false courtesy. "What a relief to find you safe and sound. Your sudden departure from Dodge City had us very worried." "I don't doubt it," she replied with sarcasm that surprised even Daniel. "Your concern is legendary, Mr. Brennan, especially for helpless widows. The man's smile tensed. You have a pending debt, ma'am. Your late husband's, and I have documents that prove it. He took a folded paper from his jacket. The sheriff of Dodge City is very interested in talking to you about certain missing jewelry. It was a blatant lie. Thomas had never owned valuable jewelry, and they both knew it. But they also knew that laws could be twisted, that witnesses could be bought, that solitary widows rarely won against men with power and money. There is no legitimate debt, Daniel intervened, his voice calm but firm. And there are no stolen jewels. Just a man trying to abuse his power to get what he wants. Brennan narrowed his eyes, evaluating this new obstacle in his path. Don't get involved in this, Cowboy, he warned. This is a matter between the lady and me. A legal matter. If it's legal, present yourself before Judge Porter in Willow Creek, Daniel replied. Sheriff Thompson will be delighted to hear your case. The mention of local authorities made Brennan visibly tense. Willow Creek was small, but its judge was known for being incorruptible. A rare and problematic quality for men like him. This can end two ways, Reed, Brennan said, abandoning his courteous tone. Either you hand over the woman now, or we'll come back with more men and burn this shack to the ground. With you inside, Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah. There's a third option, he said in a measured voice. You leave now and forget that Mrs. Mitchell exists. You continue with your business in Dodge City, and we with ours here. Brennan let out a humorless laugh. And why would I do that? I have the law on my side, 3 guns against your old rifle, and every reason to take this woman. Because you're not alone, a new voice said from the forest edge. Samuel Foster emerged from among the trees, his rifle aiming precisely. And behind him, to everyone's surprise, appeared 3 other men on horseback. Sarah recognized old Jensen, whose ranch bordered Daniel's lands to the east, and the Williams brothers, known for their skill with weapons and their contempt for bullies. Brennan visibly paled. The equation had changed. This isn't your business. He tried, but his voice had lost authority. You're wrong, Victor, Samuel replied, advancing. When you threaten one of ours, you threaten us all, and Daniel is one of ours. And the lady too now. The other men nodded, silently closing ranks. It was the unwritten law of the frontier. Neighbors protected each other, however distant their cabins, however scarce their interactions. They survived together or died alone. I have documents, Brennan insisted, but the paper in his hand now seemed insignificant before the collective determination he faced. Sarah stepped forward, positioning herself next to Daniel. Your documents are as false as your debts, Brennan, she said with a clear voice. My husband may have had shady dealings with you, but I have no legal obligation. And what you really seek, her eyes hardened, was never for sale. A tense silence spread across the clearing. Brennan looked around, calculating his options. Crawford, always attentive to changing winds, had discreetly moved his hand toward his pistol. Don't try it, Crawford, Jensen warned, his rifle pointing directly at the henchman. You wouldn't leave here alive. This isn't over, Brennan growled, pulling his horse's reins to turn it. No one humiliates me like this. They already have, Daniel responded calmly. All these men. And this woman. Accept it and go your way, Brennan. There are battles you can't win. For a moment it seemed the saloon owner would launch one last threat, but something in the collective firmness surrounding him dissuaded him. With a brusque gesture to his companions, he spurred his horse and rode away at a gallop, raising a cloud of dust behind him. When the riders disappeared on the horizon, Sarah felt her legs finally give way. Daniel supported her by the elbow, a discreet but firm gesture that transmitted all the strength she needed. Do you think he'll return? She asked quietly. No, Samuel replied, approaching. Brennan is a coward at heart. He only attacks when he has the advantage, and now he knows he doesn't have it here. The other men dismounted, accepting with terse gestures Daniel's thanks. They weren't men of grand speeches or emotional expressions, but they had come when needed, and that said more than any words. You always pay your debts, Reed, Jensen said, giving him a rough pat on the shoulder. Just like your father, despite his flaws. Sarah watched Daniel's face soften at the mention of his father. It was perhaps the first positive memory anyone had shared about the man. Thank you, Daniel said simply. All of you. When the neighbors left, promising to stay alert, Sarah and Daniel remained alone on the porch. The sun was already high, bathing the prairie in golden light that seemed to celebrate their small victory. "It's over," she murmured, still processing what had happened. "It's really over." Daniel looked at her for a long time, as if memorizing every detail of her face in that moment of liberation. "It's over," he confirmed. And for the first time since they'd known each other, he smiled fully. A smile that transformed his austere face, revealing the man he could have been without so many losses, without so much loneliness. Sarah felt something loosen inside her, a knot of fear she had carried so long it had become part of her anatomy. Silent tears began to roll down her cheeks, not of sadness but of relief, of gratitude, of emotions too complex to name. Without words, Daniel extended his hand toward her, a simple gesture, an invitation. Sarah intertwined her fingers with his, rough from work, warm despite the cool morning, and so they remained, united by that elemental contact, looking toward the horizon where their pursuers had disappeared, and where, perhaps, a new future was beginning to take shape. The days following the confrontation passed in a new calm, different from the vigilant tension of before. It was genuine peace, born not from the absence of danger, but from having faced and overcome it together. The cabin, once a provisional refuge, began to subtly transform into a home. One afternoon, while Sarah sewed by the window, taking advantage of natural light, Daniel entered with a package wrapped in burlap. "I brought something," he said, with that economy of words that no longer confused Sarah. Unwrapping the package, she found seeds of different types: tomatoes, carrots, corn, squash. Simple seeds that, however, represented something profound. The possibility of putting down roots, of planting something that would take months to bear fruit. A commitment to the future. "I thought we could make a garden," he explained, almost shy about his own boldness. Behind the cabin, where it gets sun most of the day, Sarah held the seeds in her open palm, feeling their light weight but charged with promises. "I'd like that," she replied with a smile. "I'd like that very much." They worked together on the garden for days, preparing the soil, building fences to protect it from wild animals, designing an irrigation system from the nearby stream. It was a joint project that required planning, shared effort, vision of the future, and with each furrow they dug, with each seed they planted, something also bloomed between them. One night, sitting on the porch under a starry sky, Sarah dared to formulate the question that had been gestating inside her. "What are we, Daniel?" she asked softly. "You and I." He remained silent for a long time, so long that Sarah feared she had crossed some invisible line, had presumed too much. But when he finally spoke, his voice had a quality she had never heard before, vulnerable, almost tender. "I don't know how to name it," he admitted. "I've never been good with words. But I know that before you arrived this was just a cabin. Now, it's different." He turned slightly toward her, his eyes seeking hers in the half-light. "I've never had a family," he continued. "Not a real one. My father." He stopped, reorganizing his thoughts. "He taught me what I didn't want to be, but no one taught me what I could be." Until now, Sarah felt her heart expand painfully in her chest. This man of tough appearance and scarce words was opening himself to her, with an honesty that few would have had the courage to show. "I had a family," she replied. "But I never had freedom. With my father, I was his obedient daughter. With Thomas, I was the perfect wife, always what others expected of me, never myself." She extended her hand, seeking his in the darkness. Their fingers found each other, intertwined naturally. "Here with you for the first time I feel I can be both things," she continued. "Part of something greater than myself, but also completely me. It's liberating." Daniel nodded, understanding. He wasn't a man of grand speeches, but his silences had acquired eloquence for her. In the way he lightly squeezed her hand, in the inclination of his head toward her, in the way his eyes followed her every movement. There was a complete language. "I don't know what name to give this," he finally said, "but I know I want it to continue, for us to grow together like the garden." The simplicity of the metaphor, so characteristic of him, moved her deeply. It wasn't a romantic declaration, like those she had read in novels, but it contained a deeper truth, recognition that what they shared was a living process. That required care, patience, daily commitment. "I want that too," she replied, feeling the words were insufficient to express the fullness she felt. They remained like that for a long time, hands intertwined under the stars, enveloped in a silence that contained all the promises that didn't need to be verbalized. That night, for the first time, they didn't sleep in separate spaces. There was no unbridled passion or grandiose declarations, just the elemental comfort of two bodies finding refuge in each other, synchronized breathing, shared warmth. It was a natural step, like water flowing downhill, seeking its channel. At dawn, Sarah woke with her head resting on Daniel's shoulder. She observed his relaxed face in sleep, the worry lines softened, the vulnerable curve of his lips. She allowed herself to lightly caress the scar on his forearm, that testimony to past pain that was now part of the geography of the man she loved. Because it was love, she understood with sudden clarity. Not the idealized love of romantic novels, nor the comfortable but flat affection she had felt for Thomas. It was something more complex, woven with threads of mutual respect, shared vulnerability, laboriously built trust. Adult love, born from recognition of their respective strengths and weaknesses, from total acceptance of the other. When Daniel opened his eyes and found her watching him, he smiled. A smile still rare in him, but increasingly frequent. Without words, he kissed her forehead with a tenderness that said everything they needed to know. That day, they worked in the garden with renewed energy, as if emotional clarity translated into physical vigor. Each planted seed was a promise, each furrow a possibility, each drop of water, an act of faith that what they sowed today would grow tomorrow. And between them, silently also grew the certainty that they had found, against all odds, exactly where they should be. The passage of seasons brought visible changes. The garden flourished with rebellious greenery, defying the surrounding aridity. The cabin had gained small touches that transformed it. Patterned fabric curtains in the windows, a shelf carved by Daniel for the books Samuel brought them on his visits, a rocking chair on the porch where Sarah sat at sunset. The deepest change, however, was in themselves. Daniel spoke more, smiled more, as if each day of coexistence wore away a layer of the armor he had built over years of solitude. Sarah, for her part, had discovered in herself a strength she never knew she possessed. One particularly clear morning, a letter arrived. Samuel brought it personally, handing it to Sarah with a solemn expression. "From Lawyer Peterson from Willow Creek," he explained. He said it was important. When the old man left, Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Daniel watched from a distance, respecting her privacy but attentive to her reaction. The letter was brief but impactful. Thomas had owned a small plot of land in his name on the outskirts of Dodge City, land that, after his death, had legally passed to Sarah. Brennan had tried to claim it as payment for the supposed debts, but Judge Porter of Willow Creek, alerted by Samuel and the other neighbors, had investigated the case. The debts turned out to be fraudulent, and the land remained legally hers. Moreover, they had sold it in her name and were sending her the resulting money, a modest but significant sum. "It's freedom," Sarah murmured, feeling tears blur her vision. "I could go anywhere. Start over." Daniel nodded slowly, his face an impenetrable mask. But Sarah knew him well enough by now to see the fear in his eyes, the same terror of abandonment that had marked his entire life. "Or I could stay," she continued, approaching him. "Invest this in our home, in our future." The relief that flooded his face was like dawn after an endless night. "Is that what you want?" he asked, needing confirmation. "To stay here?" Sarah took his hands in hers, looking directly into his eyes. "Daniel Reed," she said with a firm voice, "I've had houses that weren't homes my whole life. My father's, where rules mattered more than people. The one I shared with Thomas, built on lies I didn't know. For the first time, I've found a real home, not because of the walls or roof, but because of who inhabits it. Because of you, because of us." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing her words. When he opened them, there was a determination in them that she recognized. "Then let's build something together," he said with that direct simplicity she had learned to love. "Something that's ours, not just mine adapted for you." The proposal contained much more than practical words about construction. It was an invitation to a shared future, to decisions made together, to a life designed by both. "Yes," she replied, feeling the word contained an entire universe of possibilities. "Let's build something together. That afternoon, sitting at the table with paper and charcoal, they began to plan an expansion of the cabin, a larger stable, a well closer to the house. Each stroke on paper was an act of faith, each shared idea a seed planted in the future. We could have a room for books, she suggested, remembering her childhood library, the only place where she had found freedom in her strict paternal home. A space to keep stories, and a workshop, he added, growing animated, for wood carving. I always wanted to make real furniture, not just functional things. As they talked, the future took shape before them. It wasn't an impossible dream, but a viable project sustained by hard work and mutual commitment. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing valuable was. But together they had the skills, determination, and now the resources to make it reality. When the sun began to set, they left the plans on the table and went out to contemplate their land. Their home. Wind gently moved the garden plants, promises of future harvests. In the distance, Copper grazed peacefully next to the new colt they had bought. The horizon was tinged with orange and purple, impossible colors that nevertheless existed, like the improbable love they had found. I never imagined this, Daniel confessed, embracing her from behind, his chin resting on her head. A life like this, neither did I, Sarah replied, leaning against his chest. But maybe that's the beauty, that we found something we didn't even know we were looking for. That night, under stars they could both now name, they sealed their commitment, not with grand promises, but with the quiet certainty of those who have chosen their path. They didn't need legal documents or religious blessings. Their union had been forged in the crucible of adversity, tempered by trust gained day by day, polished by intimate knowledge of each other. And so, while the moon ascended in the desert sky, two souls who had arrived broken to this place began the delicate, brave work of building a shared life. A life that, like the garden growing in defiance of the desert, found beauty and abundance where others saw only scarcity. A year later, the transformation was complete. The original cabin was still there, but now formed part of a larger structure. 2 new rooms, an extended porch that surrounded the house, larger windows that let in light. The garden had become a prosperous plot where not only vegetables grew but also flowers, a small act of rebellion against the desert's austerity. It was the day of the spring equinox, and Sarah had proposed celebrating it. A small party, they had decided. Nothing ostentatious, just recognition of everything they had built together. Samuel was the first to arrive carrying a bottle of quality whiskey he saved for special occasions. Then the Jensens, the Williams, other families from nearby ranches. People who had gone from being distant neighbors to something like a community. The long table that Daniel had built with his own hands was placed in the garden, under the tree they had planted the previous autumn. A young oak, barely a sapling, but which would someday give generous shade. The women had brought homemade dishes, stews, bread, cakes. The men contributed drinks and conversation. Children Sarah barely knew ran among the plants, her laughter mixing with birdsong. In the middle of the celebration, Sarah found herself observing Daniel from a distance. He was by the corral, showing Jensen's sons how to approach the colt without frightening it. His face, once so serious, now lit up with frequent smiles. His body, once always tense and vigilant, moved with new ease. He was the same man, and yet transformed like herself, she thought, unconsciously passing a hand through her hair, now cut shoulder-length in a gesture of liberation from her previous life's conventions. She was no longer the Turner widow, the pursued woman, the fugitive. She was simply Sarah, or as the neighbors now called her naturally, Mrs. Reed. They hadn't formalized their union before any authority. They didn't need to. For the small world they had built, their commitment was evident in every board of the expanded house, in every furrow of the garden, in the way their lives had intertwined until becoming indistinguishable. At sunset, when guests began to leave, Sarah and Daniel remained on the porch, watching the horizon where the sun sank in an explosion of impossible colors. "Are you happy?" he asked with that direct simplicity that had always been his hallmark. Sarah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Happiness wasn't a concept she had expected to achieve. For much of her life, she had settled for security, for absence of conflict, for a tranquility she now recognized as mere resignation. "I'm more than happy," she finally replied. I'm at peace. I'm complete. Daniel nodded, understanding the depth of what she expressed. It wasn't the temporary euphoria the world called happiness. It was something more substantial, a fullness born of authenticity, of having found herself and the other, of having built something meaningful from the broken fragments of their previous lives. From the garden came the aroma of the first night flowers opening to the nascent moon. Her sweet but wild fragrance like the life they had chosen. "When I found you under that oak tree," Daniel said, intertwining his fingers with hers, "I thought I was only saving you, and I thought I was just looking for temporary refuge," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "Neither of us imagined this." "This," he repeated, and in that simple word was contained everything: the house, the garden, the community they had attracted, but above all, the bond that united them. A bond forged not in desperate need, but in mutual recognition, in conscious choice, in shared work day after day. That night, under a sky studded with stars they could both now name, Sarah reflected on life's unexpected paths. How what seemed like an ending, Thomas's death, Brennan's pursuit, desperate flight, had actually been a beginning. How the desert, which she had feared as a place of death, had become the setting of her rebirth. And beside her, breathing rhythmically in the darkness, Daniel slept with the tranquility of one who has found his place in the world. A man who had built walls around his heart, and who slowly had learned to tear them down. Not for everyone, but for her. Not from weakness, but from the strength born of true trust. At dawn, the first ray of sun illuminated the carved wooden figure and the small bottle of lavender essence that occupied a place of honor on the shelf. Two simple objects charged with history, symbols of what they had been and what they had chosen to be together. Outside, the desert stretched vast and immutable, but here, in this small oasis they had created, life flourished in ways neither had believed possible. And it would continue to flourish season after season, nourished by the deep roots they had put down together.